And we're back with Skallagrim's Falchion. Now, we had to put this project on a brief of a pause, the reason being all the prep work going into making pieces for Blade Show. But since we're back, something's missing. It does not have a pommel. And a pommel is quite necessary for a sword. We can just go on ahead and grab one of the standard mushroom pommels and grind it to shape. However, what I do, I forge, so I'm going to forge out a rough preform of the fleur de lis pommel that goes on the sword, give it to Matt, and Matt will do what he does and bring it up to snuff. To make an object just like a pommel, one needs to first select the stock, or the material from which the piece will be made. I take a piece of mild steel and heat it up. After the piece is hot enough, I move on to the power hammer, flatten it and square it up, producing a rectangle. After the rectangle is to size, I use a hot cut to cut in the characteristic sections that will become the fleur de lis. After the sections are cut in, I move to the other power hammer and use the drawing dies to neck in the foot of the pommel. Most people assume that you need an absolutely even hex, square, or round object to turn on the lathe. But that's only true if you have not thought about what the lathe does. A lathe does not turn a symmetrical object, a lathe makes any object symmetrically round. So, what I did, I took a forged pommel, ground the foot of it slightly rounder than it was for comfort, and drilled a pilot hole, a centering hole at the top of it. Then, what I did is, take a look, I used a centering piece right here and stuck it into my little hole right here. And then, while the hole was located on the centering piece, like so, boom, 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 I finally shut down the jaws of the lathe. Let's tighten it a little bit more. Boom. And what this produced is I created my own geometric center around which the piece will turn. And that center is going to be the center that the hole will follow once I replace the centering set with a drill bit in the lathe. So let's check how well and nice and centered the object turns. See, it's pretty good. Now that I have my geometric center, we have to turn it into a physical center by drilling a hole. In order to do that, I have to replace this bit right here with a piece that receives the drill bit. I know what I'm doing because I had 2 years of turning and machine turning classes in Russia on a lathe, and that lathe was better because it was Russian, not this. So let's try it. Goes like so.
Alright, now that the hole is drilled all the way through our pommel, I'm going to move to the vertical mill and induce a slot in the bottom of the pommel. The reason I'm doing that is proper pommel construction needs to fit onto the tang. If it just has a rod or twists on or whatever, it has a very likely chance of just snapping off in combat. So we actually want the tang to fit up in there, not only for structure, but also so it doesn't get cantered. If you have a slot in there that fits the tang just right, however that pommel goes on, it's always going to be that way, and then you hot peen or screw in from the top. So let's move to the vertical mill, put a little slot in, and then we can move to the grinder and start finalizing all our shape. In the center. So the shape of the pommel on the original sword is pretty bland. It's very blocky, but one thing is very nice, and that it has a very defined foot on the pommel. Even if that design didn't have it in it, I probably would have altered it a little bit and added a foot anyway, because I feel like that really terminates a pommel into the handle nicely. Before I create that foot, the first thing I want to do is make sure the bottom of our pommel is fairly round. I'm going to use a technique that we use here at BKS all the time, which is just sliding a round rod. Since we have a hole all the way through the pommel, I can literally just spin this pommel on this rod as I'm sanding, and it'll get very close to perfectly round. Then I'll move on to using this tool once again on the narrow wheel to start creating that foot. Alright, now that the foot of the pommel is completely established, I'm going to move on to some of the finer details. I'm going to stay here on the narrow wheel and get in on all these little corners, get everything as flat as I can, and then I'm going to start doing the cut-ins with the narrow wheel as well. It's going to give us a finer detail than the original, but I think it's much needed for this thing to look just right.
Oh, that's beautiful. Slavic art is this.
After I did the cut-in work on the narrow wheel, I took a long, careful look at this pommel and decided it needed a little bit more detail. So now I'm going to move to a very small radius wheel, start by truing up the perimeters, then knocking the corners, creating a very elegant bevel. With the details on our pommel now finalized and roughed in, I don't want to move any further on the pommel until I get it rough fitted to the tang. So what I'm going to do is take our sword, give myself a mark. So what I'm going to do from here, since we have a 1/4 inch hole all the way through our pommel, is I'm going to neck in this part of the tang to roughly 1/4 inch, slide the pommel on slowly until I have it fit just right, and then we can move on to doing all the final polishing and shaping.
Alright, now the pommel exists. Oops, hold up. Boom. The pommel exists. It's quite nice. And what's left is polish on the pommel, creating the pin block. This pommel is not going to be removable, but affixed permanently onto the blade, and make the wooden core for the handle, which will be wire wrapped at a later point. After all these things are completed, what needs to happen is the blade needs some hand sanding with a little bit of sandpaper and sharpening, and it will be ready to be packed and shipped off to Canada for Falchion.
Skallagrim. Skallagrim. Is Falchion.
Yeah, okay. Right. And the piece will be shipped off to Canada for Skallagrim. Falchion.
Falchion.
Falchion. Canada. vanadium.
Sweet.
Don't forget to like the video, and as always, we ask you to consider subscribing to That Works.